I won't try to make this easier to hear. I won't wrap it in careful explanations or soften the edges so that what I'm about to say feels less significant than it actually is. Because it has already become significant. Some things can be explained slowly. Some things need context before they make sense. And then there are things that simply arrive at a point where explanation becomes unnecessary. This is one of those things. Whatever has happened between us didn't announce itself. There was no moment where everything suddenly changed, and both of us could point to it and say, that was the beginning. There was no obvious turning point, no dramatic confession, no single conversation that could explain why everything feels different now. It happened underneath all of that, quietly, almost invisibly, one observation at a time, one silence at a time, one moment where you understood something without needing it explained. And perhaps that is why it became so difficult to recognize, because the things that change us most deeply rarely arrive with noise. They become noticeable only after they have already changed the shape of everything around them. That is what happened with you. I didn't notice you becoming important. I noticed that you already were. There is a difference, a significant one. Importance usually develops through familiarity. You spend time with someone, you learn their habits, you hear their stories, you collect memories, you understand their reactions. Eventually, after enough time has passed, their presence becomes familiar enough to matter. That would make sense. That would be explainable. That would fit into the way I understand people. But this didn't happen that way. You became familiar before there was enough history to justify familiarity. And I still don't know how to explain that without making it sound more mysterious than it is. Maybe it isn't mysterious. Maybe some people simply recognize patterns that resemble something inside themselves. Maybe there are forms of understanding that don't require years to develop. Maybe two people can encounter each other and, without knowing each other's entire stories, immediately recognize something in the way the other person thinks, the way they pause, the way they observe, the way they remain silent, the way they choose words, the way they don't say certain things. That kind of recognition doesn't need a long history. It only needs accuracy. And somehow, you were accurate. You noticed things without turning them into conclusions. You understood moments without forcing them into explanations. You seemed to know when something needed words, and when words would only interfere. That difference mattered more than you probably realized, because most people listen for information. You listened for meaning. Most people wait for an answer. You noticed the reason behind the hesitation. Most people see silence as an absence. You seem to understand that silence can contain more than speech, and I noticed all of it, even when I didn't acknowledge that I had noticed, especially then. Because acknowledging it would have meant admitting that something unusual was happening, and I wasn't ready to do that. I had become very good at keeping things in their places. People in one category, conversations in another, feelings somewhere else. Expectations kept at a safe distance, nothing overlapping, nothing becoming complicated, nothing gaining enough importance to disturb the internal order I had built. That order was not accidental. It took time. It came from learning that not everything deserves access. Not everyone deserves an explanation. Not everyone who asks a question deserves an answer. Not everyone who shows interest actually wants to understand you. Sometimes people want information because information gives them a sense of control. They want to know what makes you react, What makes you vulnerable? What makes you stay? What makes you leave? And once they have enough pieces, they create a version of you that makes sense to them, not necessarily the real version, just the version they can understand. I learned a long time ago to prevent that. So I became selective, careful, measured. I learned how much to reveal, how much to hold back, when to answer, when not to, when to allow someone closer, when to quietly restore the distance. It worked. For a long time, it worked perfectly. Then you appeared. And strangely enough, you didn't challenge the system. You didn't demand access. You didn't insist on knowing what I wouldn't explain. You didn't treat distance as an invitation to push harder. You didn't try to decode me just because I was difficult to read. You simply remained present. That was different, more different than you probably understand. Because resistance is easy to deal with. If someone pushes, you know where the boundary is. You can reinforce it. You can step back. You can make the distance obvious. But someone who doesn't push, someone who simply understands where the boundary is without needing it explained, that changes the entire dynamic. There is nothing to resist, nothing to fight, nothing to defend against. And that is exactly how something can move closer without ever appearing to cross a line. You didn't force your way into my world. You became familiar with it, and somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing the distance between yours and mine. That should have concerned me. It did, but not enough to make me leave. That is what I keep coming back to. Because I know myself, if something feels wrong, I don't spend months negotiating with it internally. I don't romanticize instability. I don't confuse intensity with meaning. I don't keep things alive simply because they're interesting. If something doesn't belong, I remove it. Quickly. Cleanly. Without needing a dramatic ending. But with you, I didn't do that. Instead, I watched. I paid attention. I allowed the pattern to reveal itself. And the more I watched, the harder it became to call it coincidence. There were too many moments, too many small details, too many instances where something I hadn't said was understood anyway. Not guessed. Understood. That distinction matters. Guessing is probability. Understanding is recognition. A guess can be wrong. Recognition feels different. It doesn't feel like someone reaching toward an answer. It feels like someone already knows the shape of the answer and is simply waiting for you to confirm it. You did that more than once. Maybe you didn't realize it. Maybe you did. I still don't know. But I remember the feeling, that strange pause where something inside me went completely still. Not because I was shocked, because I was certain. Certain that you had noticed something I had deliberately left unspoken. And the strange thing was that I didn't feel exposed. I expected to. Normally, being seen too clearly creates a kind of discomfort. You become aware of every part of yourself that you usually keep private. You start wondering what the other person thinks, what they've concluded, what they might do with what they've seen. But with you, the reaction was different. I felt recognized without feeling examined. There is a huge difference between those two things. Being examined makes you feel like an object under observation. Being recognized makes you feel like a person whose existence has finally been accurately perceived. You didn't dissect me, you didn't reduce me, you didn't turn me into a theory. You simply noticed, and somehow that was more powerful than anything else could have been. Because I have spent a lot of time being misunderstood by people who believed they understood me. That kind of misunderstanding is exhausting. They hear one sentence and build an entire personality around it. They see one reaction and decide what it means. They witness one moment of silence and assume they know the reason. They create a story and then interact with the story instead of the person. You didn't do that. You left space for uncertainty. You allowed me to remain complicated. You didn't need every contradiction resolved. And that made it possible for me to exist around you without constantly monitoring how I was being perceived. That is rare, almost unnervingly rare, because when you stop monitoring yourself around someone, you eventually realize that you've given them something more valuable than information. You've given them access to the unedited version, the version that doesn't prepare every sentence, the version that doesn't calculate every reaction, the version that doesn't pause before every response to decide whether the truth is too much. And I began noticing that happening. The pause disappeared, the filter became lighter. The need to explain every thought weakened. I wasn't consciously choosing openness. I simply stopped needing as much protection. And that was when I knew something had changed. Not because I suddenly trusted you completely. Trust isn't something I give because a moment feels right. Trust develops. It gets tested. It survives uncertainty. It proves itself through consistency. But something came before trust. Recognition. A sense that you understood the structure beneath what I was saying. And that was enough to make me lower certain defenses without even realizing it. I didn't decide to let you closer. There wasn't a meeting inside my head where I approved it. It just happened. And once I noticed, it was already too late to pretend nothing had changed. You had already become part of my internal landscape. That sounds more dramatic than I mean it. I'm not saying you became the center of everything. You didn't. What happened was quieter. You became one of the reference points. A perspective my mind sometimes reached for automatically. A presence that influenced the way I processed certain things. A thought that sometimes appeared before I realized I was thinking of you. That is what made this difficult, because thinking about someone is simple. You can identify it, you can name it, you can redirect it. But when someone's way of thinking becomes part of the way you think, the boundary becomes less obvious. You don't necessarily think about them. You think differently because you have known them. And that difference remains even when they aren't present. That is what you changed, not just what I think, how I think. You altered the questions I ask myself. You changed the way I interpret certain silences. You made me notice things I might previously have dismissed. Not because you instructed me to. Not because you tried to influence me, because your presence revealed another way of seeing. And once you've seen something from another angle, you can't completely return to the old perspective. You can ignore it. You can choose not to use it. But you know it's there. That is impact. Real impact doesn't need permission. It doesn't need constant contact. It doesn't require someone to be physically present. It leaves behind a change in perception. And I think that is what happened here. You didn't become important because I decided you should be. You became important because my mind began accounting for you without asking me. That should have been enough to make me uncomfortable. But there was something else beneath the discomfort, relief. And I didn't expect that. I thought being understood this deeply would make me feel exposed. Instead, part of me felt tired of pretending I needed to remain unreadable. Maybe that's what your presence did. It didn't break the walls. It made me question why I was still standing behind them. That is a much more dangerous thing. because walls are easy to maintain when you believe they're protecting something, but once you start questioning whether you still need them, they become difficult to justify. And I had built mine carefully. I knew every reason for every distance. Every rule had a purpose. Every boundary had history behind it. I wasn't going to dismantle all of that because someone felt familiar. But you weren't asking me to. You weren't saying, "Let me in." You weren't demanding that I become more open. You weren't trying to prove that I could trust you. You simply existed. And somehow, that was enough. There is something almost unfair about that, because effort gives you something to evaluate. You can decide whether the effort is genuine. You can question the motivation. You can determine whether someone deserves the access they're requesting. But presence without demand? That bypasses all of those calculations. It gives you nothing obvious to defend against. And slowly, without realizing it, you start meeting the person halfway, not because they asked, because you want to. That is the part I don't usually admit. I didn't just allow this. At some point, I participated in it. I stayed in conversations that I could have ended. I returned to thoughts I could have dismissed. I noticed details I could have ignored. I allowed moments to mean more than they technically needed to mean. And every time I did that, I made another small decision. None of them felt significant individually. Together, they became a direction, and that direction led here, to this point where I can no longer honestly say that you're simply someone I happen to understand. You're someone whose presence has become woven into certain parts of my internal world. And I don't know whether that is something I should celebrate or be cautious about, maybe both, because anything that matters carries risk, and I don't avoid risk because I'm afraid. I avoid unnecessary risk because I understand consequences. That distinction matters to me. I don't need everything to be safe. I need it to be real, and this feels real. Not because it is intense. Intensity can be manufactured. Not because it is emotional. Emotion can be temporary. Not because it is complicated. Complication means nothing by itself. It feels real because it has consistency, because it keeps appearing in different forms, because it survives silence, because it doesn't depend on constant reassurance, because even when nothing happens, something remains. That is what convinces me. Not the moments themselves, the continuity between them. Anyone can create one powerful moment. Almost anyone can say something meaningful once. But consistency reveals structure. And the structure between us has become impossible for me to ignore. There is a certain rhythm to it. You notice, I respond, I pull back, you don't chase. I return, you don't demand an explanation. And somehow the connection survives every movement. That tells me something. It tells me this isn't being held together by pressure. It isn't dependent on performance. It doesn't require either of us to constantly prove its existence. It remains. And things that remain without being forced deserve attention. So, I've been paying attention. More than I probably should. I've noticed how certain conversations stay with me long after they end. How some sentences return unexpectedly. How a particular pause can carry more meaning than an entire explanation. How I sometimes find myself considering what you would notice about something before I decide what I think about it. That last part took me by surprise, because that means you've become part of the process, not the destination, the process, and there is something profoundly intimate about that kind of influence. You don't have to be the person someone's constantly thinks about to matter deeply. Sometimes you matter because you have changed the way they encounter everything else. That is what you have done. You didn't replace anything. You added another dimension. And now certain things look different. Not because the world changed, because the way I look at it did. I wonder if you know how unusual that is. Probably not. People often underestimate the effect they have when they're not trying to have one. They assume impact requires dramatic action. It doesn't. Sometimes the deepest impact comes from the smallest behavior, repeated consistently. Listening, remembering, not interrupting, not forcing, not turning someone else's complexity into a problem. You did those things, and they accumulated. Until one day, I realized I wasn't interacting with you the way I interact with most people. There was less calculation, less performance, less distance, and more presence. That word keeps returning to me. Presence. Because that's what this seems to be built around. Not constant communication, not constant reassurance. Presence. The knowledge that something exists even when it isn't being actively discussed. That is harder to create than closeness. Closeness can be created through time. Presence is different. Presence means someone has become real enough inside your awareness that their absence doesn't erase them. And you became that. I don't say that lightly, because I know what it means. It means that whatever happens next, something has already changed. Even if we never define this, even if we never give it a name, even if the circumstances change. The fact that I have experienced this kind of recognition with you cannot be undone. That doesn't mean I am demanding a future. It doesn't mean I am pretending to know where this goes. It means I'm acknowledging the reality of what has already happened, and that is enough for now. Maybe that's what I was resisting, not the connection itself. The responsibility of acknowledging it, because once you acknowledge something, you can no longer pretend you didn't see it. And I have always preferred clarity, even when clarity is inconvenient, especially then. So here is the clearest version I can give you. You matter to me in a way I did not plan. You occupy a place I did not intentionally create. You changed something in me without trying to, and I am aware of it. There. That is the truth beneath all the analysis. I could keep explaining it for hours. I could describe every layer, every contradiction, every reason this should have remained simple. But underneath all of that, the truth is still the same. You matter. And the strange thing is that saying it doesn't make the situation feel heavier. It makes it feel cleaner. Like finally placing the correct name on something that has existed without one, not a label, a recognition. There is still so much I don't know. I don't know what you think about all of this. I don't know whether you experience the same shifts. I don't know whether you notice the same details. I don't know whether the connection feels as natural to you as it does to me. And for once, I don't need to know immediately. That may be another thing you changed. I used to believe uncertainty was something that needed to be resolved. Now, I understand that some uncertainty simply needs to be respected. Not every unknown is a problem. Sometimes the unknown is where something honest is allowed to develop without pressure. I don't want to force this into a shape simply because undefined things make me uncomfortable. I don't want to turn something meaningful into something artificial just because I need certainty. If this is real, it can survive time. If it isn't, no amount of definition will make it real. So I am willing to let reality answer, not fantasy, not assumptions, not projection. Reality. What happens consistently? What remains when the excitement disappears? What survives ordinary days? What continues when neither person is trying to create a moment? That's what will tell me what this actually is. And maybe that's the healthiest way to approach something this unusual, not by denying it, not by exaggerating it, by observing what it becomes. Because I don't want to fall in love with an idea of what this could be. I don't want to confuse potential with